I'm Margaret Halbrook, 78 years old, and I was setting the table for a family dinner I hadn't been invited to. I smoothed the crease from the linen runner my mother embroidered in 1949 and unfolded each cloth napkin with care. They told me to be there early, said I was good at presentation, better than Diane. Anyway, I chose my navy dress with the pearl buttons, just formal enough not to stand out. Not so plain as to invite comments from Peter. By the time I placed the last fork beside the new china, I had already decided what I was going to do. They just didn't know it yet. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments and tap that like and subscribe button. If you've ever had to smile while someone quietly pushed you out of your own life. I grew up in Indiana, the youngest of 4 girls in a home where kindness wasn't taught with words but with action. My father fixed neighbors' fences without being asked. My mother left casseroles on porches when someone passed. We didn't talk about generosity, we just lived it. That's what I carried with me through college into my career as a public school math teacher and later into motherhood. I moved to South Burlington after I finished my degree. It was quieter then, not the polished suburb. It is now. Hugo was born a year later. I didn't tell anyone who his father was, and no one pressed too hard. Small towns had ways of swallowing rumors without choking on them. I taught geometry and algebra at the high school. For over 30 years, gave lessons in the evenings to make ends meet some months. I wasn't sure which would give out first, my back or my patience, but I managed. I always did. When Hugo graduated with honors, I felt something close to relief. He was sharp, good with people, eager to prove himself. He went into real estate, said he liked helping people find homes. Said it with the same certainty I once heard in his father's voice. Just before he left town, I never remarried, never really had time between work and raising a son. The apartment I lived in now wasn't grand, but it was clean, filled with books and photos and quiet corners. I loved my kitchen windowsill where basil grew year-round. Loved the way the hallway light hit my old quilt in the morning. No one ever asked if I was happy, and I never bothered to explain. Lucy was my granddaughter, 19, now thoughtful, if a little scattered. She reminded me of myself before I learned to keep my thoughts in my head and my wallet zipped tight. Her older brother Peter had Diane's edge too, polished, too practiced. His hugs were always 1 second too late. The Sunday before the dinner, Hugo didn't call, not at 9, not at 10. That was unusual. He was punctual with obligations. He called them check-ins, but I could hear the timer in his voice. Diane called instead. Chirpy as ever invited me to Friday's dinner. Said it was important family news and would I mind coming early to help set the table. I said yes, of course. I always said yes to those things, what they didn't know what no one knew, not even Lucy was, that I had quietly turned $1,000 into $500,000 over 15 years, watching stocks and patterns and learning more in my 70s than I ever had in college. Math gave me order numbers, told the truth when people wouldn't. That money was supposed to be a surprise, a gift to buy them, the Victorian on Maple Street, mortgage-free, no strings attached. A way to finally give Hugo what he always said he wanted. His own place to raise his family, a kitchen. Diane could remodel to her heart's content, space for Lucy to study in peace, maybe even a room for me if they ever wanted me to stay over. Not that they ever had, but sitting there, folding napkins in a dress older than their marriage. I had a feeling this dinner wasn't for me. Not really, not in the way I'd hoped. Diane came in just before 7. Smoothing her hair, checking the wine glasses, she smiled at me and said, "Cordelia, this looks beautiful." Then added, "Don't forget to wear something a little dressier next time we're celebrating, after all." I looked at her, then at the gold-rimmed plates and the way Peter poured himself a second glass of wine before dinner even started, and I wondered just what it was we were celebrating. I'd find out soon enough. Dinner began, the way so many family dinners do, with small talk, and the clinking of silverware, the sound of Diane fussing over the serving dishes, Peter helping himself to a second roll before anyone else had finished their salad. The new china looked almost too bright under the chandelier, every gold rim glinting, as if the plates themselves were waiting for an announcement. Hugo poured the wine carefully, more careful than usual, and I could tell he was holding on to his words, letting Diane take the lead with cheerful stories about her day and Peter's latest classes. Lucy was quiet, her eyes shifting between her plate and the window, as if she'd rather be anywhere else. For a while, the conversation drifted around the table, polite and ordinary. Diane described the renovation plans for a house she hoped they'd buy, speaking of open kitchens and big bay windows, her voice rising each time she mentioned the yard or the sunroom. Hugo nodded along, making notes on his phone between bites. Peter cracked jokes that barely landed, but no one seemed willing to correct him. It was only after dessert, after Diane had served the apple pie she said was my favorite, that Hugo set down his fork and cleared his throat. He looked at me for a long moment, then at Diane, who nodded ready. "Mom," Hugo began, "we wanted to talk to you about something important." He tried to keep his tone casual, but the way he leaned forward told me this was no ordinary request. Diane placed her hand over his, squeezing gently as if they'd rehearsed this. Peter just rolled his eyes, but stayed quiet for once. Lucy's shoulders tensed. Hugo talked about how the family was growing, how it would be better if everyone had their own space. He mentioned the Maple Street house, the one with the wraparound porch and old oaks in the yard, how perfect it would be for raising kids, for hosting holidays, for building a future together. Then his tone softened, and he looked at me the way he used to when he was a boy, asking for another cookie before dinner. "Mom, your apartment, it's getting to be a lot for you, isn't it? Stairs, old wiring, not the best neighborhood for someone your age. We've found a wonderful place, Sun Terraces. It's a residence for active seniors with a garden view, a library, even a pool. You'd have friends, activities, medical staff, just in case." Diane took over, her voice full of reassurance, painting a picture of cheerful outings and new friends, as if moving out of my home and into this new place would be a gift. I listened to their pitch. They told me about the cost, about how selling my apartment would give me enough money for several years at Sun Terraces, and how the remainder could help with their down payment. Hugo made it sound practical, like it was for my own good, but his eyes kept drifting to the window, as if he didn't want to meet mine. Diane kept smiling, pressing her napkin flat on her lap, her fingers shaking only a little. Lucy glanced at me, worry flickering across her face. Peter shrugged, cutting another slice of pie. "How much would you need from me?" I asked. Hugo hesitated, then admitted they needed $200,000 for the down payment. The rest would cover my new residence. He explained the monthly cost, calculated how long the money would last, and then left a silence at the end, as if waiting for me to say yes. For a moment, I let the quiet sit in the room. I looked at each of them, my son, his wife, my grandchildren. Peter was the first to break the silence, pushing back his chair and grinning. "Let's be honest," he said. "You want the old lady out of your hair before she gets any older." Diane gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Hugo scolded Peter, his voice sharp. Lucy just stared at her plate. I folded my hands in my lap, the linen napkin soft beneath my fingers. I asked a few questions about the place, about what would happen when the money ran out. Hugo answered, avoiding my eyes, and Diane tried to smooth over the awkwardness with reassurances about how I'd love it there, how it was for the best. They talked about safety, about convenience, about how I'd be surrounded by people my own age. I nodded along, listening, but a coldness settled in my chest. Peter continued unfiltered, saying what the others wouldn't. "She'll be gone in a few years anyway," he said, "so why not get the money now?" I looked at Lucy. She met my gaze for a moment, then dropped her eyes, her cheeks red. I glanced at Diane, at Hugo, both of them waiting, both of them hoping I would simply agree. For a moment, I thought of the years spent in that apartment, late nights grading papers, morning sun on the kitchen counter, Lucy at the table with her homework, Hugo as a boy running through the halls. "I need some time," I said quietly. "It's a big decision." Hugo relaxed, thinking I was giving in. Diane smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Peter just shrugged, finished his pie, and left the table. Lucy squeezed my hand under the table, a quiet signal. After dinner, they called a cab for me despite my protests that the bus was just fine. At the door, Lucy slipped me a quick hug and whispered, "Grandma, you don't have to do anything you don't want to." I nodded, holding on to that moment, that small flicker of warmth. Back in my apartment, the rooms felt different, as if the walls had shifted. I sat by the window, thinking of all the things left unsaid. Outside, the streetlights cast long shadows, and I wondered how long my family had been planning this, how long they'd seen me as an obstacle instead of a person. I thought of the check in my purse, the money I'd quietly saved, and how they'd never even considered what I might want. As I lay in bed that night, the conversation echoed through my mind. The promise of what's best for everyone. The cheerful voices turning over practicalities the way Peter had said out loud, what the rest only hinted. I knew the next family dinner would bring more pressure, more persuasion, and maybe a choice that would finally set things in motion. What they didn't know was that I had choices too, and I was already starting to think about using them. The evening after the dinner, I wandered through my apartment with the kind of restlessness that lingers after an argument, even when no voices are raised. I set my purse down on the kitchen table and listened to the faint hum of the refrigerator. The tick of the old wall clock, the steady quiet that had been my companion for years. The living room was just as I'd left it. Photos of Hugo at his high school graduation, Lucy's drawing taped to the side of a bookshelf, a faded quilt folded over the arm of the couch. Everything in its place, though. I felt unsettled in mine. I poured myself a cup of tea, sat by the window, and watched headlights flicker past. South Burlington was quiet at night, just a few late walkers and the occasional couple on their way home from a restaurant. The night air felt thick. I opened the window a few inches to let it in. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, reminding me how life could change in a heartbeat, how security could slip away while you were busy making dinner or folding napkins. I tried to sleep, but my mind kept replaying Hugo's voice, gentle, reasonable, turning every argument back to what was best for me. I remembered Diane's hand on mine, her perfectly painted nails, pressing just a little too hard, her voice too bright as she described the activities at Sun Terraces. Even Peter's careless words tossed out between bites of pie stuck with me longer than I expected. She'll be gone in a few years anyway. It echoed sharp every time I closed my eyes. The next morning, I moved through the old routines, oatmeal on the stove, a quick sweep of the kitchen floor, the crossword puzzle in the newspaper. Nothing felt quite right. I kept looking at the phone, half expecting it to ring, half hoping it wouldn't. It was Sunday, Hugo's usual day to call, but the hours ticked by with nothing but silence. I spent the afternoon sorting through old letters and school memorabilia papers from my years at the high school student awards, notes from colleagues, a faded thank you card from Lucy, written in shaky handwriting when she was 7. I found the little jewelry box where I kept important things, the emergency cash, my passport, and now the check I'd written out, $500,000 unsigned, tucked into a blank envelope. I held it for a moment, considering the weight of all those years, all those choices. I wasn't sure anymore who it was meant for. At dusk, I slipped on my sweater and walked to the park across the street. I saw Lucy sitting on a bench near the swings, her long hair pulled into a messy ponytail, a paperback open on her lap. She didn't notice me right away, so I sat on the bench beside her, leaving a little space between us. The sky was streaked with pink and gold, the air crisp. "Hi, Grandma," she said, glancing up and smiling softly. "Hi, Lucy." I watched as she closed her book and tucked it into her backpack. "Did you have a good day?" She shrugged. "It was all right. Mom's in a mood. Dad keeps talking about the house." She hesitated, then looked at me. "Are you really thinking about moving to that place they picked out?" I looked at the swings at the empty playground. "I haven't decided," I said, quietly. Lucy leaned in her voice lower. "You don't have to go if you don't want to. You know that, right?" I nodded, grateful for her concern, for the way she seemed to see past the surface of things. We sat in silence for a while, listening to the wind rustling through the trees. After Lucy left, I wandered home slowly. My apartment felt different again, smaller somehow, as if the walls were closing in a little each day. I looked at the check in the envelope, then slid it back into the jewelry box. The decision could wait, or maybe it couldn't. It was hard to tell anymore. The next few days passed with the same kind of heavy quiet. I heard from Hugo twice short calls to check in and to see if I'd made a decision yet. Each time, his voice was careful, polite, but there was an edge beneath it, a barely disguised impatience. Diane texted about the paperwork for the new house, the timeline, the need to move quickly. I answered as simply as I could. I needed time to think. One afternoon, I pulled out my old scrapbook, the one I started in my 20s, filled with magazine cuttings and postcards I'd never sent. On the last page, tucked between a faded photo of the sea and a recipe clipped from a travel magazine, I found a quote I'd written years ago. "It's never too late to become what you could have been." I traced the letters with my finger and sat for a long time, the words circling through my mind. I wondered what would happen if I finally believed them. Later that week, Lucy stopped by with a bag of groceries, almond croissants, and coffee from the bakery on Main. She set the table and poured the coffee without asking, then sat across from me with her hands folded. "Grandma, can I stay for a while?" she asked. I nodded. We ate in comfortable silence, the only sound the clink of china and the faint whistle of the kettle. After a few bites, Lucy looked up, her eyes serious. "I'm sorry for what Dad and Mom said the other night. And Peter, too." I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "You have nothing to apologize for." She pressed her lips together, then said, "I just want you to be happy. That's all. I don't think anyone else is really thinking about that." For a moment, the heaviness in my chest eased. When she left, the apartment seemed lighter, as if her presence had opened the curtains and let in a little more sun. I watched her walk down the street, then turned back to my scrapbook, reading old notes about places I'd dreamed of visiting, coastal towns, cities I'd only ever seen in books. I remembered the feeling of possibility before years of responsibility pressed everything into neat, manageable boxes. The week wore on, and the calls kept coming. Each time Hugo sounded more insistent, and Diane's messages grew sharper, even when wrapped in sweet words. I could hear the strain beneath every question, the hope that I would just say yes and solve their problems. I found myself replaying memories, years spent working 2 jobs, the weight of doing everything alone, the long hours after school when I graded papers and hoped Hugo was all right in his room. One night, I sat by the window looking at the empty street below, the shadows stretching long across the pavement. I thought about the years I'd spent making sure everyone else was cared for, never asking for much in return. Now, the silence in the apartment wasn't comfort, but something closer to a reckoning. It felt like a question I'd been putting off for decades, and now there was nowhere left to hide from it. As I finally turned off the lamp and got ready for bed, I realized that nothing would go back to the way it was. The family dinner had set something in motion, and there was no stopping it now. In the quiet, with only the hum of the city outside, I lay awake wondering how much longer I would keep waiting for someone else to decide what happened next. By the time dawn crept in through the blinds, I knew I couldn't stay in this quiet suffering forever. Something had to change, even if I wasn't sure yet what it would be. The days ahead would bring the answer whether I wanted it or not. Friday arrived with a sharpness in the air that felt different from any ordinary day. I woke early, moving quietly through the apartment, choosing my dress with care. and pinning my hair the way I used to for important occasions. The check was folded in an envelope resting at the bottom of my purse, unsigned. All week, I turned it over in my mind whether I would give it to them or keep it for myself, but the answer stayed just out of reach. Diane greeted me at the door, her smile a little tight, her black dress as crisp as starched linen. In the kitchen, Hugo was stirring sauce, more focused than usual, and Peter lounged on the sofa, his eyes on his phone, barely looking up when I came in. Lucy was already at the table, a book open on her lap. The whole house seemed to hum with anticipation, as if something had been set in motion and none of us could slow it down. Dinner began with all the usual courtesies, small talk about Peter's classes, Diane's new job, a brief mention of Hugo's latest project at the agency. I helped set the plates and poured water into the glasses, my hand steady. When we finally gathered at the table, Hugo opened a bottle of wine, the cork popping loud in the quiet room. "Tonight is about family," he said, filling each glass. "We have some decisions to make, but first, let's eat together." The meal passed in careful conversation, everyone holding back. I could feel Hugo watching me between bites, as if waiting for a sign. Peter was the first to break the silence, asking, "So, Grandma, are you selling your place or what?" Diane shot him a look, but Hugo took it as his cue. He set his fork down and turned to me. "Mom, have you thought more about sun terraces?" About the apartment, I looked at each of them, then reached for my purse and slid the envelope onto the table. "I want to show you something." Hugo took the envelope, opened it, and his eyes widened. Diane leaned over his shoulder. Peter sat up straighter. Lucy glanced from me to the check, her brow furrowed. Hugo turned the check over in his hands. $500,000. "Where did this come from?" he asked, barely above a whisper. Diane's hand trembled as she reached for the check, scanning it for any sign it wasn't real. I explained quietly that I'd invested over the years, that the biotech stock I'd bought had done well. "I wanted to surprise you," I said, "by buying the house on Maple Street outright, a gift, no mortgage, just a way to help." I let my words settle into the silence. For a moment, no one spoke. Peter was the first to find his voice. "That's a lot of money," he said, his tone somewhere between disbelief and envy. Hugo looked at Diane, then back at me. "You were going to give us this?" Diane asked, her eyes wide. "All of it," I nodded. "I was. Until last week." Hugo's face fell. Diane pressed her lips together. Peter let out a low whistle and muttered something under his breath. The disappointment in the room was thick, but I kept going. "After our last conversation, I realized maybe that isn't what I want to do anymore." Peter leaned back, shaking his head. "So, we just miss out," he said, his voice sharper now. Diane's eyes welled, and Hugo started to speak, but I held up a hand. "I haven't decided what I'll do with it yet. I'm still thinking." I took the envelope back and placed it in my lap. Lucy was the first to break the new silence, her voice soft. "Grandma, you should do what makes you happy." She gave me a small, sincere smile. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. Hugo started again, softer this time. "Mom, we really need that house. We've already put down a deposit. Without your help," I shook my head gently. "I understand, but I'm not sure this is the right way. Maybe there's something different I'm meant to do with the money." Diane's voice broke through, higher and thinner than before. "But what about us? What about everything we've done for you?" She trailed off, unable to meet my eyes. "What exactly have you done for me, Diane?" I asked, not unkindly. "I've always tried to help where I could, but I have to think about myself now." Peter gave a sarcastic laugh and pushed his chair back, mumbling about the waste of a good house. Lucy squeezed my hand again and said, "If you want to travel, Grandma, or do something for yourself, I think you should." The rest of the meal passed in fits and starts, the conversation broken and halting. After dinner, as I gathered my coat, Hugo tried once more. "You don't have to decide tonight, Mom. Just think about it. For us." Diane was silent, dabbing her eyes with a napkin. Peter said nothing. Lucy followed me to the door. "If you ever want to talk," she said, "I'll always listen." Outside, the evening felt brighter, the air fresh with possibility. I walked home in the cool darkness, feeling each step as its own small act of courage. At home, I put the envelope away, sat at the kitchen table, and stared at the city lights for a long time. The next morning, Lucy's knock woke me, a bag of pastries in one hand, coffee in the other, and a smile that felt like a promise. I didn't know what I would do with my choices yet, but for the first time in years, the answer felt like it might belong to me alone. The sun was barely up when Lucy knocked a soft rap on the door that felt more like a gentle question than an intrusion. I opened it to see her standing there with a bag of croissants from the French bakery and 2 cups of coffee, her cheeks pink from the morning chill. She smiled almost shy and stepped inside, placing breakfast on the kitchen table the way she always did as a child after a sleepover. There was no hurry. We set out plates and cutlery in silence, the apartment still wrapped in that quiet you only get before the day has truly begun. Lucy poured the coffee, careful not to spill, then looked at me with the steady, open gaze I remembered from her girlhood. "I wanted to see you," she said. "I hope that's okay." I told her it was more than okay, and sat across from her, feeling the warmth of the mug seep into my hands. For a while, we ate without talking, the buttery scent of almonds filling the kitchen. Every so often, Lucy would glance at me as if searching for words that would fit. Finally, she set her cup down and spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Grandma, are you really going to leave?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I asked if she'd ever thought about leaving South Burlington College, all of it. Lucy hesitated, then nodded. "Sometimes. I don't know what I want. I only know I don't want to do what everyone expects." She looked down at her hands. "Dad and Mom want me to stay in school, finish business administration. But I don't care about it. I like writing, or taking pictures, or maybe traveling." Her honesty was like a breath of fresh air. I told her that when I was her age, I'd felt the same longing, and how dreams had a way of getting buried beneath what others needed from you. She reached across the table, took my hand, and squeezed. "If you want to go, Grandma, I think you should. And if you want company, maybe I could come too." The idea of traveling together 2 generations, both searching for something new, made the kitchen feel suddenly bigger, brighter. Lucy confessed what had been weighing on her heart. "Grandma, Dad, and Mom aren't as desperate as they pretend. Dad got a big promotion. Mom's working again. They could afford a house if they stopped buying cars and taking trips." I listened as she described the new Audi, the recent vacation, the country club membership, things I'd suspected. But hearing them from Lucy made the truth sharp and clear. "They just want the easy way out," she finished. "It isn't about need." I let her words settle. I wasn't surprised, but it changed something all the same. I told her I was proud of her. Proud. She saw things for what they were. Proud she was honest enough to say them out loud. "You're not like them, Lucy. You have a good heart. Don't lose it trying to make everyone else happy." She smiled, but I could see the worry still clouding her face. "What are you going to do?" she asked quietly. I didn't have a plan yet, only a growing sense that the path ahead was mine to choose. "I'm not sure," I said, "but for the first time in a long time, it feels like I might have a choice." Lucy nodded, accepting my answer for now. We cleared the dishes together, the easy silence between us a comfort I'd almost forgotten. When she left, promising to visit soon, I wandered the apartment and opened my old scrapbook. There were clippings from travel magazines, old postcards, photographs of cities and seas I'd once planned to visit, On the last page, a photo of a small white house by the ocean waves breaking in the background, and in my handwriting, someday. I traced the letters, wondering if someday might finally be today. The next few days, I let myself imagine. I walked the neighborhood, noticing the way light filtered through the maples, the sound of children playing at the park, the distant bell of a church tower. I called a local realtor, not Hugo's agency, and described the kind of place I was looking for: something small, quiet, with a garden if possible, and in the South Hill neighborhood, where the air was always fresh and the streets were lined with old oaks. Veronica, the realtor, listened kindly, promising to send a list of houses that might suit. That week, I saw 3 houses. The first was too large, echoing with a loneliness I recognized from my own apartment. The second sat too close to a busy road, but the third set back from the street, with a neat picket fence and a garden blooming with late summer roses, felt different. Inside, sunlight filled every corner, and the back porch looked out onto an old gazebo draped in grapevines. "This is the one," I told Veronica, and heard my own voice steady for the first time in months. The owners, a retired couple heading to Florida, agreed to sell quickly and without fuss. I made a full payment, no mortgage, and signed the papers with a hand that didn't shake. I packed only the things I loved: books, photographs, a few keepsakes from my mother, and the old blue quilt that had followed me from one home to the next. Lucy helped me pack her presents, making the days lighter. Each evening, we would sit together among boxes and talk about her dreams, my memories, and what it meant to finally have a space of one's own. When moving day came, I left most of my old furniture behind and watched as strangers, soon to be new owners, walked through the apartment that had held so much of my life. There was a gentle kind of sadness in closing that door, but more than anything, there was relief. The house on South Hill welcomed me with quiet mornings, and the scent of jasmine drifting from the neighbor's yard. I started a small garden, took a class at the community center, and joined a group for seniors who played cards on Sundays. I met Margaret, who brought me fresh tomatoes, and Frank, who told stories about his days as an engineer. For the first time in years, I felt myself slowly rooting into new ground. All the while, I kept my plans to myself. Lucy knew, but promised not to say a word. Hugo's calls grew less frequent, and I didn't answer right away. Each day, I grew more certain I'd made the right choice. That sometimes the smallest acts, buying a house, planting flowers, saying no, were the ones that mattered most. I didn't know what would come next, only that when the past came knocking, I would be ready to meet it on my own terms. The next part of my story would begin with a doorbell on a quiet Saturday, and a conversation I'd been avoiding for too long. Saturday morning came with a light breeze and the sound of cardinals in the garden. I had just slipped on my gloves and was about to prune the roses when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. Glancing up, I saw Hugo's car at the gate, sleek black, the sort of car he'd always wanted, glinting in the sun. He stepped out, hesitated, then walked up the path, his eyes fixed on the house and the neat rows of newly planted flowers. I waited, not moving, watching him take in the white shutters, the tidy porch, the garden that was slowly beginning to look like home. He stopped at the gate and called, "Mom, is this really your place?" I took off my gloves and walked over, standing on the path. "Yes, Hugo, this is my house." He looked at me, still surprised, maybe even a little lost. "You bought a house." When did all this happen? I could see the calculations in his eyes, the cost, the decision, the fact that I had done this without a word to him. A couple of weeks ago, I told him I wanted a place with a garden and some quiet. I didn't need anything bigger. I opened the gate and let him step inside. He looked around, still taking it in. "Why didn't you say anything?" I led him through the house, pointing out the sunroom, the small kitchen with blue tile, the reading chair near the window where I drank my morning coffee. He asked questions mostly about the sale of the old apartment, how much I got for it, and if I used a realtor. His questions were quick and practical the way he'd always talked business. I poured us tea and set the cups on the kitchen table, waiting for the real conversation to begin. He was quieter now, glancing around, his posture more closed off than usual. I wanted to apologize, Mom, for the way things went at dinner, for what Peter said, for all of it. I nodded and waited. We thought the retirement place would be safer, that's all. He looked at his hands. But I know you didn't want that. I listened as he tried to smooth things over, offering the same explanations he'd rehearsed before. Diane and we're still short on the down payment for the new house. We were hoping you might help. Just as a loan, we could pay you back. His words landed quietly, but I heard them as clearly as I ever had, his need dressed up as concern, a request wrapped in the old language of family. I set down my tea and looked at him, letting the silence fill the space between us. You and Diane are both working now. You just bought a new car, took that trip. You could buy a house without my help. Hugo's face tightened. We have expenses, Mom. Things come up. I let him speak, watched the old pattern play out, reasons, justifications, promises. In the end, it all led to the same request for me to step in and make things easier. I shook my head gently. Hugo, I bought this house with my own money. I want to live here. I'm not going to give you the money for your down payment, not as a loan, not as a gift. He stared at me, trying to read my expression. But you were going to buy us a house before? You said so yourself. I nodded. I was, before I realized what you and Diane were planning for me. The words sat heavy between us, but I didn't take them back. He looked away, a flash of anger passing through his features, then something like resignation. So what are you going to do with it then? All that money. I picked up my tea and took a sip. I'll use it for myself. Maybe some for the grandkids if they need help with school. Maybe I'll travel or donate or just enjoy what I have for once. He slumped in his chair, shoulders sagging. It's not fair, he said, almost under his breath. We're your family. I let the words sit there, no longer feeling the need to argue or explain. You have a good job, Hugo. You can provide for yourself. He ran a hand through his hair the way he always did when he was a boy and didn't know what to say. You could at least help with college for Lucy and Peter. I nodded. If they need it, they know where to find me. But not for houses or cars or things you can afford on your own. The conversation faded after that. We sat in silence for a long moment, the clink of china the only sound. I offered him more tea, but he shook his head. Diane wants to know if you'll come for dinner next week, he said, almost as an afterthought. Lucy misses you. I smiled gently. I miss her too. Tell her to come by any time. He stood up, thanked me for the tea, and paused in the doorway. I'm glad you're okay, Mom. I nodded. I am. He walked out to his car and drove away, and I stood in the doorway for a while, watching the dust settle in the driveway. The house was quiet again, the garden waiting for me to come back. I took off my shoes, stepped out onto the grass, and bent to gather the clippings I'd left behind. Inside, the phone sat silent. I knew the calls would come again, maybe softer, maybe with new promises. But I felt lighter, as if a weight I'd carried for years had finally begun to lift. The sun slipped behind the maples, casting long shadows across the yard. I walked inside, poured the last of the tea, and sat by the window, letting the evening settle over everything I'd built with my own hands. Tomorrow would bring new choices and maybe new tests, but for now, I was home, and the life ahead was finally quietly my own. The next day would open with a familiar knock, this time not from the past, but from the future I was beginning to imagine. The following morning dawned clear sunlight creeping through the blinds and warming the wooden floor beneath my bare feet. I was in the kitchen, setting out a bowl of strawberries, when the doorbell rang, a bright, insistent sound that echoed through the house. I opened the door to find Lucy backpack slung over her shoulder and a hopeful look in her eyes. "Hi, Grandma. Is now a good time?" she asked. I stepped aside and let her in, noticing how comfortable she already seemed in this new place, how quickly she moved to fill the kettle and rummage for mugs. We settled at the kitchen table, steam curling from our coffee, and for a while, neither of us said much. I watched her searching for any sign of worry or regret. Finally, she spoke. "Dad knows I've been coming here," she said. "He asked me not to bother you, but I told him it was my choice." Her hands played with the handle of her mug. "He's still upset you wouldn't help with the house." I nodded, letting the silence linger, letting her set the pace. Lucy shifted in her seat, then took a deep breath. "Grandma, I don't want to go back to college, not for business, not for what they want. I've been thinking maybe I could change my major or even take a break for a while. Is that crazy?" There was so much of her younger self in that question. The little girl who used to press wildflowers between pages of her books, who always asked if it was okay to be different. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "You have to live a life that's yours, Lucy. If you want to write or take pictures or travel for a while, you should do it." I saw the relief in her eyes, the hope flicker across her face. "Would you help me?" she asked. "If I decide to switch or take some time off?" I didn't hesitate. "Of course. Whatever you need." Her shoulders relaxed and she smiled, really smiled. For the first time in a long while, she looked lighter. "Dad says it's a waste, but I don't care. I want to do something that feels real." We talked then about possibilities and plans about small towns and big cities, about how sometimes the right path isn't the easiest one. I promised to help her with tuition or living expenses, or just support if that was what she needed most. Our conversation drifted gentle and easy. She asked about my gardening class, about Margaret and Frank, and the others I'd met since moving. We talked about recipes, old stories, books we wanted to read together someday. The house felt full of laughter, of shared understanding, of the quiet sort of love that doesn't need grand gestures. Later that afternoon, I heard Hugo's car again. He didn't come inside, just sat out front, engine idling. I could see him through the kitchen window, hands tight on the steering wheel. After a minute, he drove away. Lucy saw it too and said, "He'll come around, Grandma. He always does." I nodded, hoping she was right, but not feeling responsible for his feelings, the way I once might have. The next Sunday, I hosted lunch for the first time in my new home. I baked a lemon cake and set out plates in the garden. Margaret brought tomatoes from her yard, and Frank arrived with a carton of blueberries and a story about a chess match that ran late into the night. Lucy came early to help arranging wildflowers in a vase, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. She greeted my friends, easily slipping into conversation as if she'd known them all her life. The afternoon unfolded in the slow, pleasant way that summer days do. We talked about favorite books, music from years ago, how fast the tomatoes had come in this season. Frank taught Lucy how to play a hand of gin rummy. Margaret asked about her plans for the fall, and Lucy spoke openly about wanting to write, to travel, to find something she could believe in. I watched her listening and felt a quiet pride that I'd had even a small part in her growing up. Later, as the sun dipped low and the guests said their goodbyes, Lucy lingered on the porch. "Thank you, Grandma. For everything. For believing in me." I hugged her, breathing in the scent of her shampoo, and told her she'd always have a place here, no matter where her path took her. As she left, I felt a sense of peace that was new to me, steady, lasting, more powerful than any fleeting happiness I'd known before. That night, alone in the quiet of my own house, I realized how much had changed. My life was no longer measured by what others needed from me or what they expected. I had given Lucy what I'd longed for all those years, a safe place to land and the freedom to dream a little bigger. As summer settled into its warmest days, the garden outside my window grew full and wild roses spilling over the fence bees, drifting from flower to flower. Each morning I woke with a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. There were no more urgent calls, no quiet demands for help, no more feeling invisible in my own family. The house was mine, and so was this quiet, open stretch of time. Lucy stopped by often sometimes just to share coffee or help trim the apple tree, sometimes with stories of her writing class or new friends she'd made at the library. Her voice grew stronger each week, her laughter easier. I could see the lightness in her, the beginning of a life built on her own terms. It was a gift to witness her stepping into herself and to know I'd had a part in that. Hugo called once in a while. His voice was softer than it used to be, less hurried, as if he was learning how to listen as much as to talk. We spoke of ordinary things, the weather, the garden, how Peter was doing at school. There was no talk of money anymore, no expectations or disappointment hovering between us. It wasn't a perfect relationship, but it felt honest, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't dread hearing his voice. Diane sent a birthday card signed with her careful looping handwriting, and I sent back a picture of the roses in full bloom. We had both chosen a quiet truce. On Sundays, I gathered with friends under the old gazebo, Margaret telling stories about her travels, Frank sharing tips on how to keep the rabbits out of the vegetable beds. Laughter and easy conversation filled the air, the kind that comes from being seen and valued for who you are, not just what you give. There were evenings when I sat alone with a glass of wine and watched the sky fade from blue to gold to violet, and I realized that loneliness and solitude are not the same thing at all. I had built a new life, one where I was needed, but not used, where I could be both independent and connected. Looking back, I sometimes wondered why it had taken so long to claim this freedom. The truth is, it's easy to lose yourself in the patterns that family lays out, to believe that your worth is measured in what you sacrifice. But dignity, I learned, comes from choosing yourself not out of anger, but out of quiet, steady love. Justice sometimes means drawing a line and standing by it even when others can't understand. It's never too late to start over, never too late to shape your life into something softer, truer, and entirely your own. If you've listened this far, I hope you carry this story with you, a reminder that your happiness matters no matter your age or what others expect. If you've ever had to reclaim your place in your own life, or if you're still waiting for that moment, I hope you find the courage to begin. Share your story if you'd like, or simply pause and reflect on the ways you've chosen yourself. And if this story meant something to you, I'd be grateful if you joined me here again. Take care, and thank you for spending this time with me.